Well, good morning, church. Today's order of service, we are shifting straight into the Word. And in the Word, there will be worship and song and worship in the scriptures. We are going to be in the book of John, and we'll be in John chapter 8 today. But before we get there, I want to start with just a brief exercise and for us to think about a story that is really well known to many of us. It's the story in Luke chapter 15 of a father with two sons. And the younger son demands the inheritance and goes to the father and takes it all and goes off and lives on his own and spends lavishly and finds himself face down in the mud and either in desperation or repentance or some combination of both, begins to turn his feet back home. And as he's on his way home, the father, who's been looking out on the horizon, rushes out, grabs the younger son, embraces him, puts a ring on his finger, a robe around his shoulders, says, "We've killed the fattened calf. We're having a party. Rule number one is we are having a party for you today. So come on in." As they go to the party, looks around and realizes the older son, the older brother, is absent from the party. And so, in the same way that he ran out to the younger son, he leaves the party to go out to the older son. And he says, "This brother of yours was lost and now is found. Can you come celebrate with us?" It's a story that we hear pretty often in the church, and we can kind of rapid fire begin to think of all sorts of points and ideas about it. My question for us this morning, the exercise, is what do you call that story? What's the name of that story? What's the title of that story? So often I've heard that story, and the story is told as the story of the prodigal son. It's the title that I've always heard. It's the title that's always been given to that. It's the title that's almost firsthand. As soon as you hear Luke 15 and you begin to walk your way down that road, it's just the story of the prodigal son. But that word prodigal just means excessive, lavish, extravagant. Why do we only center the prodigal nature of the younger son in that story? Yeah, he spent lavishly, he lived extravagantly, and he came home in desperation. But what about the prodigal pride of the older sibling? What about the excessive, lavish pride that kept him from the party? Pride that kept him from the party. Why don't we call it the story of the prodigal sons, both of them, the younger son and the older son? Where did the title come from? How do we come to the scripture and just put a name and a narrative upon it so quickly? And why isn't it the story of the prodigal father? Why isn't it the story of the prodigal dad who excessively, extravagantly, Christine, you got it right from jump, who has been looking out on the horizon and wraps his arms around, puts a ring on his finger, a robe around his neck, killed a fattened calf? I mean, that's prodigal. That's excessive. That's lavish and extravagant. But so often, we give a story a title and a narrative that shapes it in such a way that we can only see it one way. We can only hear it one way. I want us to shift our eyes this morning to the center of the story. And not the center of that story, but the center of a different story as we move into John chapter 8, another story with another title that has shaped a narrative for far too long. And so would you join me as we look in John chapter 8 this morning? John chapter 8, we begin here in verse 2. At dawn, Jesus appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him. And Jesus sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group, and they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing Jesus, but Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and he said to them, "Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and he wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." This story, for far too often and for far too long, has been characterized and even stigmatized as the story of the woman. What's the title that you've heard a million times for this story? It's the first hand, it's the shorthand, it's the story of the woman caught in adultery. We go to John 8, and immediately that's the story that we've been told about this. But if that's the title of this story, who chose that title? A title like that, certainly it's not in our Bibles. I mean, it might be in our modern day Bibles, but it's not in the Greek. A title like that certainly is from a framed narrative from someone somewhere along the way that said, no, this is what we're going to center in this story. But if you follow the flow of that story and you keep your eyes on Jesus at the center of the story, you'll see that just as much as the story is about a woman that has been caught in adultery, it is just as much a story about a group of religious men caught in the deadly, systemic injustice of self-righteousness, legalism, oppression, and abusive leadership. But that's just too long of a title, so we had to go with the first one, right? If the story shows to us a woman caught in her sin, then just as much it shows to us a group of religious men caught in a sin that is all theirs to bear as well. And yet, while it's imperative to sit with both of these realities, and we will today, we'll sit with the story of these men, we'll sit with the story of this woman. But what I want us to see most clearly is the prodigal nature of Jesus at the center of the story. It's not a story of the younger son or the older son. It's not the story of the woman or the story of the religious men who are using abusive leadership. The story is about the grace of God and the glory of it all at the center. So we need to keep our eyes most focused on Jesus at the center of the story. What does Jesus do in this story? What does Jesus not do in this story? What does Jesus say in the story? What does Jesus not say in the story? What kind of things does Jesus invite people to live into for the rest of their lives? What kind of invitation does Jesus give us this morning? We're going to keep our feet in a pivot today. We're going to center ourselves with Jesus, and when we need to turn this way, we'll take one step over here to look at how Jesus approaches the men. When we need to come back to our center, we'll turn and pivot our bodies over here to see how Jesus interacts with this woman, and then we'll come back to our pivot and we'll stand in the center of Jesus, our cornerstone in this story first and foremost. When Inez and I were talking about this passage a couple of weeks ago, she kept bringing my attention back to John chapter 1, verse 14. A centering word from the very beginning of our time in this book. The Word became flesh. Jesus made his dwelling among us. We've seen Jesus' glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and full of truth. Full of grace and full of truth. This morning, as we sit in the story, we're going to sit in the story of a Jesus who shows us the glory of it all. The glory of a God who is filled with grace. The glory of a God who is filled with truth. And so rather than pray our way into this sermon, we're going to spend some time singing as well. And so would we turn our hearts to sing just a brief refrain to center us this morning on the center of this story. Jesus at the center of it all. Jesus at the center of it all. From beginning to the end, it'll always be, it's always been you, Jesus. Jesus. We sang this together last week. As we came to God in need, as we came to God in desperation, as we came to God in prayers of petition and asking, and as we came to God in prayers of praise and thanksgiving. And so, God, we come to you again this morning to center You in the story, you are at the center of it all. Jesus at the center of it all. Jesus at the center of it all. From beginning to the end, it'll always be, it's always been you, Jesus. Jesus. Nothing else matters. Nothing else matters than Jesus at the center of it all, and Jesus certainly stands at the center of this story. And so as we come to Jesus, I want you to see that right away, church. Jesus at the center of it all. The story centers on Jesus as we turn in John chapter 8. And you'll find some clues right away that the story even recognizes that Jesus is at the center of it all. In fact, it's him teaching in the temple courts. So the narrative, the protagonist, Jesus is right there at the middle, right from the get-go. The people are all gathered around him, and he is leading the people. And so Jesus, this rabbi, this son of Mary and Joseph, this one who has been leading this band of ragamuffins through it all, he is there at the center of that story. And there at those temple grounds, where all the people are gathered around him, as he sits down to teach and others lean in to listen, it says the teachers of the law and the Pharisees come to him. And so as we look here at the scriptures for just a moment, you'll see he appears in the temple courts early in the morning at dawn. So the first thing he does, all the people are gathered around. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they bring in a woman caught in adultery. I want you to notice a few things contextually about this part of the story. First, they only bring the woman. The man should have been present to, according to the law in Deuteronomy, as you go back, as you look at what the Old Testament, what the Pharisees should have been living into and following. This was not a law only aimed at the woman. The man should have been brought before the group as well. In fact, the Deuteronomic law, the Mosaic law, is actually aimed first at the man. It's not aimed first at the woman. It's aimed and spoken to in that patriarchal culture to the man first. But the man's nowhere present. Secondly, there should have been witnesses. The Deuteronomic law says that the witnesses should have been present. If she is caught in adultery, then we need to know by whom and how and what's the story there. And we need to have witnesses present that can prosecute and bring that before the court. But the story never mentions any witnesses. So we don't have a trial here, folks. We should wipe our hands and walk away because you didn't bring the man, you don't got no witnesses, come back when you got something. But third, we realize they don't care about a trial in the first place for the woman. This was never about her. This was also never about the law. What did we see there? The teachers of the law, the Pharisees, they brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap. To trap whom? In order to have a basis for accusing him. They were using the question. They were using the woman in order to trap Jesus. This was always about Jesus on trial, not the woman. This was always about the religious leaders trying to trap Jesus. So the woman is being objectified in her sin and in her body simply as a means to expose not her, but to expose Jesus. The ugliness and brokenness and abusive leadership of all of that. As they present her to Jesus, their last question to him is, "Now what do you say?" And what did Jesus say? What was Jesus' response? Verse 5 at the end, "Now what do you say?" They're using this question as a trap. And what's Jesus' response? But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. What did he say? He didn't. He put his knee to the ground in nonviolent protest and put his body in between hers and theirs. Why? Because the indignity of their injustice need not necessitate his response. The indignity of their injustice need not necessitate his response. He doesn't have to play the games on their terms. He is not swayed by them. And then by shifting the focus on him, all eyes on me, Jesus says, his response, his actions, his movements, he absorbs the weight of their anger and their animosity and their energy and their zeal in the sin and the shame. And all the while, Jesus is allowing his body to be centered and not hers. He serves as a shield and a barrier to the woman that has been dragged here today. And Jesus's unwillingness to capitulate to their crazy drives them even crazier. His unwillingness to capitulate to their corruptness drives them even more corrupt. His unwillingness to capitulate to their chaos, it just spins them even deeper into chaos as Jesus just continues to write in the sand. Now, much has been made of this whole writing on the ground thing. Pastors, preachers, writers, commentators, everybody's trying to figure out, dude, that's just weird. What are you doing? So much ink has been spilled on trying to figure out, what is Jesus doing in this story? Why are you on the ground writing in a... I mean, my son Sam does that every day, but he's not trying to be Jesus while he's doing it. He's just trying to be in the dirt. My pastor growing up, wild mountain man, adventurer, just lived life larger than life, and also just had a cheeky sense of humor with a wink in his eye always. And he believes what Jesus is doing is writing a note to the woman in the ground that says, if this doesn't work, run, get out of here, go. I'm just trying to stall for just a moment so we can get out of here. I don't have a plan. You think I have a plan because I'm Jesus? I don't have a plan. This is not good. Just bounce. No, I don't really think that's what's happening there. But you can try it if you ever get caught in a situation. Another commentator I was reading this week, Dr. Julie Barrier, she pointed our attention instead to Jeremiah 17:13. And maybe there's something here. I don't know. It says in Jeremiah, one of the prophets in the Old Testament, Lord, you are the hope of Israel. All who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water. This allusion to the spring of living water, it comes right on the heels of a chapter before in John 7, which Pastora Inez led us in a couple of weeks ago as we looked at the Holy Spirit, that spring, that life of living water, those rivers of living water. But even more than that, I want to point our attention to that written in the dust piece, because there was an ancient temple practice for the Jews. There's a religious act in the circumstances of sin, and in the pursuit of justice and shalom, they would come to the temple, and the presiding priest would write out their sins in the dust. Why in the dust? So they could be wiped away. So perhaps, as Jesus kneels down and writes in the sand, our high priest, in his own temple, writes the sins of all present. Maybe the woman's, maybe right next to it, all the sins of all the men present too, in plain sight for all to see. And he doesn't do so to balance the scales between her and them. He does so to balance the scales between them and him. He does so to show that all sin, the waywardness, the wrongfulness, the wickedness, whatever measure on the spectrum the sin sits, all of the sin falls short of the glory of God before them in that moment. And then he stands and he begins to speak back to these men. Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Whew. Jesus. Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Let any of you who is without sin. Pastora Inez reminded me as we sat in this passage that Jesus is the fulfillment of truth and grace. And I believe we see that truth elevating off the page here. Jesus is reshaping a lived out embodiment of truth that these men need to hold for the rest of their lives. Never again will they be able to co-opt the law for their own pride-filled purposes, but how having these words of Jesus ringing in their ears, he who is without sin, throw the first stone. He who is without sin, throw the first stone. The next time they want to go try to grab a woman and bring her before, he who is without sin, throw the first stone. Jesus' expression of truth here, this lived out word that the word has spoken, is shaping a new shalom. It's pushing against that old power, and it's embodying a new one. It's a greater one, a greater truth, one that is more just, one that is more equitable for all, one that says you're not allowed to hurt another and call it religion no more. You're not allowed to hurt one another and call it religion anymore. True religion is this: caring for the widow and the orphan, proclaiming good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, setting the oppressed free, proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor, a law of love that simply says, whoever is without sin, throw your stone. And the religious leaders, those who've always had the first and the last word, they now stand awestruck with this word from the word. And I want you to see this. Whatever stones they showed up with, they fall to the ground. Because their sins were heavier than their stones, and they couldn't hold both. Their sins were heavier than their stones, and they couldn't hold both. Church, I'm telling you, Jesus saw it in that moment. He must have gotten a glimpse just in that short, brief moment. Stones everywhere falling, the sound of rock upon rock hitting the ground. Church, I'm telling you, Jesus saw piles of stones everywhere he went. From then on, little pillars of rock as reminders of Jesus's call to justice, Jesus's invitation to new ways of life, where you drop the stones because you're still carrying the sin, little piles of stone outside the church, outside the workplace, outside the school, outside the home, certainly on the side of the 210 as people are throwing stones out the window because they want to embody and enact another kind of sin in that moment. But you know what? I got my own mess. I need to just go ahead and set this stone down. Here in our church, I want to honor that you're here today. For many of you, it's a miracle that you're here today. Because for far too many, for far too long, church has been a society of stone throwers. And I know enough of you by now to know that that's true for many of you. So I want to honor your story today. I want to honor your body today. I want to honor your hurt today. And I also want to honor your healing today. I also want to acknowledge that some of us have been the stone throwers. Either in retaliation of those who threw it at us and we caught it and we threw it right back, or perhaps in older days of legalism, self-righteousness, snapping at a friend or a family member or a coworker. Today, I want to give you an opportunity to give Jesus all the stones back. The ones we've thrown, the ones that were thrown at us, the ones that landed and have begun to make a heart of stone where there should be a heart of flesh. Just want to give you an opportunity just this morning. Wherever they came from, however they landed, we can give them back. You can say, Jesus, my heart and my body were never meant to hold this. So I just give it to you, God, because I can't hold it anymore. It's weighing me down. It's not producing any fruit in my life. If anything, it's just always keeping me on the ready like David with rocks in a slingshot, just ready to take down the next Goliath that gets in my way. But I'm no David, God. I'm not meant to carry these stones in my pocket. They deserve it. Can I say that? I might be able to write some names on each one of these. Can we just truth tell about that? There are some folks, but can we also truth tell? For those who can hold this, for those whose hearts have been tenderized enough that we've thrown some too. I lean not on my own understanding. My life is in the hands of the maker of heaven. I lean not on my own understanding. My life is in the hands of the maker of heaven. And I give it all to you, God, trusting that you'll make something beautiful out of me. Yes, I give it all to you, God, trusting that you'll make something beautiful out of me. Yes, I will live this life with my hands wide open. I will live this life with my hands wide open. 'Cause there's nothing I hold on to. There's nothing I hold on to. There's nothing I hold on to. 'Cause I'm just holding on to you. There's nothing I hold on to. There's nothing I hold on to. There's nothing I hold on to. 'Cause I'm just holding on to you. And you're holding on to me. I want you to notice this in the story. It's crazy. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time. The older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. I think this is mind-blowing. And sometimes I skip over this part of the story. The men walk away. Did you notice that? Did you notice that they listened to Jesus? They came there to trap Jesus, and Jesus instead has authority and power over them. It's not the other way around. Jesus is at the center of this story. As we pivoted to hear and to hold what happened in that moment, did you notice that they didn't have to listen to Jesus, but they did? Like, we assume that's the case because he's Jesus. He walks on water. He turns water to wine. He is the living water. We just assumed that that would be the case because we know they had an encounter with Jesus. But for all they knew, they had an encounter with Joseph and Mary's son. A rabbi, a rebel, a false messiah, a band of ragamuffins that had just been following him around. He had no real authority over them, not legal authority, not worldly power over them. But he bore the power of the glory of God upon him, the glory of grace, the glory of truth. And when they came face to face with the glory of God, they listened because they came face to face with a new law of love in Jesus, justice in Jesus, truth in Jesus. And once they saw the truth, they couldn't unsee. Even in their pride, that couldn't get in the way. Jesus wouldn't let the law turn us into stone throwers. Jesus would put his very body in between their pride and our pain. Jesus, the one who would once write the law on solid stone, now stands as the living stone and the cornerstone and tells us to set down our stones. For just as our bodies were never meant to receive them, so our hearts were never meant to hold them. Jesus, the one who rolls away the stone and walks a resurrection road with us. The woman looks up, and a resurrection has just taken place in her life. I don't believe she expected to still be standing there. In fact, I think when Jesus began writing on the ground, she was like, aren't you going to do something? And then when he tells them, hey, y'all can throw stones if you're without sin, I'm sure she's looking at him like, that's not a good plan either. These are the people least possible to confess, name, and acknowledge their own sin. Why would you give them permission such as that? But Jesus knew. And so only Jesus is left. And the woman was still standing there. He straightens up and he begins to ask her. Did you notice that too? Did you see that part in the story? Jesus had straightened up and talked to the men. Now, in the same way, Jesus straightens up and talks to her. Notice him at the center of the story. Watch and follow his movements, his body, his words. Notice Jesus stands up and talks face to face with her, just as he did the religious leaders. Our Jesus sees her, not as a prop, but as a person. She is not evidence in this trial. She is evidence of the imago Dei upon her very being. And just as the religious leaders were not the embodiment of the law to Jesus, they're sinners too. So is this woman not the embodiment of sin. She is human too. The grace and justice of Jesus genuinely treat her as she actually deserved to be treated. Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin. Though our Jesus had every right to condemn, he didn't. The only one capable of throwing a stone, he didn't. So many of us live our lives so afraid that God's a stone thrower. God's not a stone thrower. God rolls away the stone because God's a life giver. Go now and leave your life of sin. I do not condemn you. Whatever you've done before, live a new life now. Whatever you've done before, live a just life now. Whatever you've done before, live a righteous life now. Live a shalom-filled life. Live a generous life. Live a beautiful life. Whatever you've done before, don't just live a spared life. I didn't just spare you. I'm giving you an invitation to live a set-free life, a life of freedom in open pastures. God takes our hearts of stone and returns to us a heart of flesh. This is the grace of God. I remember many years ago being at a men's retreat, and it was a men's retreat where only a small group of men attended at a time. And there was a small group of leaders that would sit and hear and hold our stories. And I'd shared my stories before, but quickly, once I got to the retreat, I realized, oh, you mean like the real story, not like the nice church story. Like, you want to hear my real life. So my pastor modeled it, and I'd heard his PG story many times, but this was the first time I got the director's cut. And when I heard the real, I was like, oh, can I say hell no on a church Sunday? Like, it was one of those where I was like, this is not good. This is not good. This is not good. Because now I got to share my real story. And I remember sharing my story. And this pastor of mine was also my boss. He was also my spiritual grandfather. He was my Gandalf. He was my Dumbledore. He was the guy who had been there my whole life and raised me up in the faith and sat down with me in the scriptures and taken me on adventures. He was that kind of guy. He had the ability to hire and fire me as I was the youth pastor at this church as well. And so I remember I couldn't keep my eyes on him when I told my story. I just had to focus only on the story because I was worried about the response, because I was worried about the stones. I was worried that if I shared my real truth, that I would experience some real stones in response. Because I was still afraid that God was a stone-throwing God. And as I finished my story and I kept my head down, I remember looking at the ground and seeing these mountain men of a feet standing before me, and I was like, oh, crap. It's Craig. And I looked up into my boss's eyes, my spiritual grandfather's eyes. In just holding eye contact was hard. I didn't know what he was going to say, because now he knew my whole truth. He put his hands on my shoulders and he says, Bobby, I've never loved you more than I love you right now. And I just fell into his arms like a little boy. I was like, just hold me. I had never experienced grace like that. Like physical, the embrace of grace, I had never experienced it like that. Why? Because I had never given my full truth to somebody that could fully hold it and hear it and say, I don't condemn you for it. Go live a life free of sin. Live a free life, a full life. This is the God who is full of truth and full of grace. May we magnify God's grace this morning, a grace that isn't cheap, but is costly. Jesus puts his body at the center of the story to hold and embody grace. And he doesn't just let us off the hook. He invites us to live a new life altogether. He pivots to the men. No more throwing stones. He pivots to the woman. I see you, and I don't condemn you. Go live a full, free life. And just as this woman faced this grave injustice, as many here have, a deathly one, so do many of us experience the ugliness, the violence of injustice in our lives on a daily basis. And also, we too humbly hold this truth. We too are prone to wonder. We too are capable and culpable of sin. The story doesn't shy away from letting us know that she's a sinner. It allows us to identify with her even in that, the injustice of it, but also her own sin. We don't escape that part of the story. And Jesus doesn't either. And he advocates and puts his body in between us and theirs, even as we come to Jesus as sinners. May we be mindful of our own lives of sin as well. The sin that so easily entangles us, especially as we're trying to do what the Lord requires of us, to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly of our God. Perhaps you've experienced at church, you're doing great work out there, but you're also still living with this torment in here. You are calling out the injustice of our day one moment out there, but in the next, you are stuck not in the systemic sin of society, but in your own cycle of sin. There is this terrible tension swirling within you every which way you go, in our homes, in our workplaces, on our drive down the 210, and messiness with our kids and our friends and our familias and our coworkers and our neighbors and our own self, the holes we continually can't quite climb up out of, even as we cry out to God. But God, I'm giving my whole life to do a great work, Jesus. Jesus gently, tenderly, grace-givingly says back to us, and I give my whole life to continue doing a great work in you. And so this Jesus, just as he honors the sanctity of life of this woman and invites her to a greater life, so too does Jesus offer and uphold the same invitation and proclamation to us as well. Leave behind a life of sin and follow me. Where is Jesus offering a new life to you today? Not condemnation, not shame, not guilt, not fear, not thrown stones. Where is Jesus turning to you and says, neither do I condemn you. Go now. Be set free from that. Live a new life. Or is Jesus inviting you into a new life today? What's your invitation? And so we fix our eyes on you, Jesus. Jesus at the center of it all, the one who alone holds truth and grace at the center of who he is. The only one left standing. The only one remaining in the center of that story. You broke my chains of sin and shame, and you covered me with grace. You mend my life with your holy fire, and you covered me with grace. You are the hand that reaches out to save. Yes, you are the hand that reaches out to save. I am set free. Oh, 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 oh. I am set free. Oh, 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 oh. It is for freedom that we are set free. God, I just pray for so much freedom this morning. Freedom from the stones thrown at us, the stones we've thrown at others, the stones that have been lodged in our hearts. Would you take our heart of stone and give us a heart of flesh, oh God? And God, would you set us free from the lived out reality and belief and conviction and identity that you're a stone thrower. And God, you are not a stone thrower. You are a life giver. You are full of truth and full of grace, and you do not come to us to condemn us today. Even in our sin, you put your body between ours, and you just hold it all at the center of it all, and you invite us to live a new life. You roll away a stone, and you roll out a resurrection road before us. God, we love you, and we thank you. And it's in your name that we pray, God. Amen.